Hi friends, Josh from the Narrate team here. This weekend, Narrate started a new series titled Focused. In the first part, Adam talks about the cost of distraction and asks, what does it mean to love God with your mind?
Hey, good morning. It is fantastic to be with all you all. Just got to make sure my cell phone's off, maybe. So I was sitting on an airplane last January, on a flight bound for Quito, Ecuador, when the flight attendants came across the PA and said the same thing that many of us have heard said a zillion different times in our lives, or at least it feels like a zillion. And she said, okay, so it's time to stow away your laptops, never mind that we're not on a ship, and then to turn your cell phones to airplane mode. And I've heard that command quite a bit in my life, but in that moment, the command to put my phone on silent created a kind of an emotional stir in me that quickly caught my attention. Now, in large part, that was because I knew that I wasn't just turning my phone off for the next 6 hours. I was turning it off for the next 4+ days because we weren't going to activate, on an international plan in Quito or anywhere in Ecuador. And so I knew that, beyond this point, my phone would go in a Ziploc bag along with my passport reserved only for emergencies. But nonetheless, there was something that happened there, something that as I've begun to study it more and more, I'm realizing that in Europe, they're already starting to treat this type of anxiety associated with the displacement of a cellular device. They're starting to treat that clinically, that there's now clinical anxiety associated with a person and their inability to have the security of technology at their fingertips. But what really then shaped me was a few days later when I was getting ready, we were a few days into the trip, and there was something that happened to me where I realized that I had worked harder mentally than I had in recent memory, harder than I knew that I could, that being in Ecuador required a certain kind of emotional focus and attention and kind of clarifying of toxic thoughts and dealing with all that stuff, that there were these long days where I was working very hard mentally to just stay on task and more so to be okay with being there. And yet simultaneously I was aware in that moment that I wasn't tired. And so there was this thing that happened where I was really apprehensive about giving up my device, and then 3 days later, I was struck by the fact that I'd worked harder mentally and was actually kind of more emotionally fulfilled than I could recall being in recent memory, and then there was this disconnect because all the normal things that I would do to take a break, to relax, those types of things where you work for 7 minutes on your computer and then you're like, I just need to check my email or whatever it is that you do, like all the normal breaks that I would take, I didn't get to take any of them. There was no email, there was no texting, there was no Bronco feed, there was no Facebook, there was none of that. Those are the things that supposedly give me rest. I didn't get any of them, and yet I was feeling more rested having worked harder than I can remember doing. And there was a sense of like, wow, maybe there's something going on here. And really it's that something that I want to explore over these next 4 weeks. I'm not anti-technology, probably any more than any of you guys. But I do think there's a conversation that isn't going to happen on its own. It's going to require a bunch of intentionality. I think maybe our great-grandkids will have some better boundaries, but we live before the age of boundaries, and so there's this conversation that I think that we've got to have as it relates to this topic. Cal Newport is a professor at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. He studied at MIT on the doctoral level prior to that. He's written a book called Deep Work. I was going to bring some. It's an expensive book. It's only in hardcover, and I don't want to front that. If you want to read it, you can go grab it. One thing I would recommend is those of you who listen to podcasts, just search his name. He's been interviewed a number of times by a number of different outlets, and he makes for a great interview. Now, the thesis of Deep Work is his thesis is this. He says that in our economy, and more so in the economy that's coming in the coming years, a person who has the ability to do deep work, that has the ability to give focused attention to something for hours or days or weeks, that person is going to be marketable in ways that they're going to be extremely marketable compared to everyone else. I butchered that sentence. His point is that the ability to focus deeply is a skill that's dissipating so rapidly that those of us who have it are going to stand to make a lot of money and be pretty indispensable in the marketplace. Now, our interest around here isn't necessarily that, though we're not necessarily opposed to it. But I guess I would say that what he's saying in our terms is the person who has the ability to focus is going to have the opportunity to serve God and serve people in ways that others won't. Now, he is not interested in the moral argument, and if you get into this stuff, you'll begin to see that there's a whole moral conversation about the way our iPhones and the internet are impacting our ability to relate to others and to God and even to do deep work. He's not interested in that, whether it's good or bad, right or wrong. That's not his deal. His deal is simply it's changing the way we work, and more specifically, it's preventing most people from having the ability to learn difficult things and solve complex problems and do creative tasks, because all of those tasks, he's arguing, requires an intensity of focus that our engagement with technology is simply robbing us of the ability to do. Follow me? So what he's saying is if you have this skill, and if your kids have this skill, they will very, very quickly rise to the top. And if you have this skill and your kids have this skill, you'll have the ability to learn difficult things and to do creative work. Now, his formula, and this isn't new to him, but it's a good reminder, he just simply points out that what we know is that high-capacity work is always it's the result of time spent and intensity of focus. And see, his thesis is that doing this every 7.5 minutes, which we'll talk about in a second, is preventing us from the intensity of focus and in many ways robbing us of the time spent. Now, this is nothing new necessarily. Albert Einstein has said similar things, or did say similar things. This quote has always been challenging to me, where he said, it's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stick with problems or stay with problems longer. It's the myth of the phenom. It's the myth of the prodigy, that prodigies will tell us over and over and over again they're not prodigies, they have intensity of focus. And I guess really what I want to get at in this series and the conversation I want to start is at what cost? Like, how are the ways that you're engaging the internet and your iPhone and the habits that you've developed, what is the cost of those habits? What's the cost, to a marriage? What's the cost? Yeah, thanks. What's the cost to your ability to connect with God? One of the phrases that will become key phrases, hopefully in the coming weeks, and I would even hope in our own everyday vocabulary, is this phrase, novel stimulation. Now, novel stimulation, again, this is an emerging clinical term that gives a clinical language to why it is that when you make it to the bathroom and realize you forgot your phone, you freak out. Because what they're saying is this, the novel stimulation is how they're describing that urge you have after 7 minutes of work, or after watching one episode, or and a commercial happens, or you're standing in line at the grocery store, that urge you have to pull your phone out of your pocket. That's what they're calling novel stimulation. Now, what they're demonstrating is that clinically, you're every bit as addicted to that as a heroin addict is to heroin, as a cocaine addict is to cocaine, as any of our addictions are. We're addicted to the hit. And it has an emotional, chemical response in our person. Novel stimulation is going to your son or daughter's soccer game, but not really going to the soccer game because you're staring at your feed. Novel stimulation is why suddenly you can't walk from your car to your office because it's boring to walk from your car to your office. And so what do? Instead, you check email. Like, novel stimulation is why you go out with a group of friends, but you quickly realize that you're all just staring at your phones together. Like, novel stimulation is why I saw some statistics and they were scary and gross, so I didn't bring them, but the percentage of people who consistently look at their phone while going to the bathroom, it's novel stimulation. It's why Esquire, or those different magazines that we used to read while we were standing in the line at the grocery store, why we don't read them anymore. Because when there's two people in front of you in line at say, Vans, it's opportunity to check your email. Here's one way to put it. How long, since you woke up this morning, what's the longest you've gone without unlocking your phone? That would be one thing to, I think, give some consideration to. Or how long have you gone without accessing the internet since you got up this morning? See, the statistics, they get pretty insane. I brought some with me. Check this out. On average, Americans spend 56.3% of their conscious life looking at screens. Now, one researcher said this, what we've demonstrated is that smoking takes 10 years off of your life. What the data says is that most people spend something like 16 years of their life in front of a screen, and so really we'd be better off culturally to start smoking again and give back the screens, because we would actually experience more life. In another survey, they asked teens about their use. Go ahead to that next slide. And they said this, 24% of American teens say they go online almost constantly. And when it comes to what they call knowledge workers, what we probably would call white-collar workers, look at these stats. 68% of American workers check email before 8 a.m. Go ahead. 50% of American workers check it in bed. And then 38% of American workers check their email at the dinner table. Facebook recently released some numbers on the use of their account holders, and what they're telling us that the average Facebook account holder spends 50 minutes per day on one of their platforms, and then goes home from work mad because they didn't have enough time to get anything done, and then goes to bed at night stressed out because this is kind of the conflict that I experienced in Ecuador. Like this is, maybe I'm exposing the lie of this. There's some recent research done on smartphone use in particular, so for the three of you who don't have one yet, which is not intended to be shaming, by the way. There are now more people in the world without toilets, there are now more people in the world without smartphones than toilets. So just in case that sounded offensive, like we're talking about a pretty broad thing here. Smartphone use in America. The average smartphone user unlocks their phone, uses their phone 110 times per day. You're going like, sweet, I'm finally above average, because that doesn't seem like very many. Now, let's just break that down. Let's just say you get up at 6 and go to bed at 10. That means that you check your smartphone 7.8 times an hour. And still, when I was like, that's not that bad. Check this out. That's once every 7.5 minutes. See, what guys like Cal Newport are saying is that stat and deep creative work, that stat and deep, authentic, abiding relationships, they can't coexist. There's a conflict of interest here. Here's one that's, if nothing else, I don't know what it is. I still haven't decided. But 1 in 5 Americans in one survey admitted that they've checked their phone while having sex. It's indicting on so many levels. I guess the question that I'm trying to pull to the surface here is not a whole-scale indictment, but rather this question, at what cost? Now, there's a gal named Sherry Turkle who teaches at MIT. Her expertise is to navigate how technology is impacting cultures and civilizations and individuals. She recently wrote a book, years ago wrote a book called Alone Together. Some of you may recognize it because we stole a series. We stole the title for a whole series where we talked about some of these things about 2.5 years ago. Sherry Turkle, in a recent interview, she shared that when that book was first released, she was attacked. She was called a curmudgeon. She was called anti-technology. She was accused of wanting to keep culture in the Stone Age because the book was released shortly after the iPhone was released. Well, more recently, she's released a new book called Reclaiming Conversation. Reclaiming Conversation. And the interviewer asked her in this interview, again, you can type her into your podcast and find all kinds of great conversations she's had. But the interviewer asked her, how is this new book being received? Anticipating the hatred and the apprehension and the suspicion. And she said, actually, none of those things are holding true. She said, actually, this time around, people are leaning into the book. And as the interviewer asked her why she thought that was the case, she said, well, we now have enough data, there's enough experience, and there's enough a collective cultural frustration that there's this growing sense of there's a problem, but we don't know what the problem is. I've actually asked Josh if he would just read this book, devour it, familiarize himself with it, and unpack the principles for us on October 9th. So we're headed towards that. But here's some of the stuff that she talks about. She talks about now that they have clinically proven that if you put a phone on a table, even if it's off, if it's visible, you can dramatically, negatively change the depth of conversation that occurs. They took it a step further, and they said, okay, let's turn the phone off, and put it within 5 feet of a person in that context. Still, they demonstrated the depth of conversation had been negatively altered. I read this week of one restaurant in Ireland that provides a locked box on Sundays, and if everybody at the dinner party will put their phone in the box and turn them off, and nobody reaches for them throughout the dinner, they'll give them 20% off of their meal. Well, why are they doing that? Because they're recognizing, wait a minute, people might actually sit around and have a deeper, longer conversation if they actually don't have the device. In fact, in that interview with the one of them that I listened to, she did some Q&A stuff, and this guy, he called in, and the language here is brilliant, if nothing else. Listen to this. This guy called in, he said, I think of my smartphone as a little electronic toolbox, but for my wife of 20 years, it's a new shiny companion. I often refer to her phone as the third member of our marriage and myself as an unwilling polygamist. So you can use that. Oh, so I'm an polygamist now? You go ahead. You could use that. So one of the things I asked her is, are you scared? Like, are you alarmed? Because when you study this type of stuff, some would say that our culture is headed for a cliff in large part because of the internet and the way that we're engaging things like our iPhones. And she actually said, no, I'm not scared at all. And the interviewer leans in and is like, wait a minute, these two things are inconsistent. How can you on the one hand say it's so bad, and on the other hand say you're not afraid? And she said, well, actually, there's a long precedent of humans with technology and new technology in particular. And she said the precedent is that what consistently happens is when we get a new technology, what follows that is carnage. But eventually, she said, culture self-corrects. It learns from its mistakes. And she actually she quotes the automobile or cites the automobile. She said, when the automobile was invented and then Henry Ford gave it to us en masse, what didn't come with it were things like speed limits and seatbelts. But over time, she said, what we recognized was that human life was not conducive to an automobile without a speed limit or a seatbelt. Some of you think it still is, but never mind. And she said, so it will self-correct. And then she went on, and it got a little dark. She said, here's what's coming. She said, 10 years from now, we're going to start looking at some statistics. And we're going to start asking questions like, why is autism off the charts in our schools? Why is ADHD so prevalent, especially among boys? Like suddenly, why can't boys do school the way they did 20 years ago? And she said it's in those instances where culture is going to start taking a deep breath and going, wait a minute. What have we done to our kids? Now, there's some good news there, right? The good news is culture will self-correct. But the more I've thought about that and the more I've listened to that, there's also some implied bad news, isn't there? Because really the good news applies to your grandkids. In many ways, the good news applies to your great-grandkids. Some of you, your great-great-grandkids. But what that means is you and I, we're far more likely to be a statistic. Because what she's saying is culture is going to get a ways down the road and they're going to go, what in the world happened? And they're going to be using our lives as negative examples of what happens to technology. We titled this weekend Marlboro Man, and it's not to be offensive towards those of you who smoke. That's not the issue at all. But it is to say that many of us, we look back on the way culture used to broach the subject of smoking, and you watch films, and you even consider that you used to be able to take a flight from Helena to Salt Lake, and everybody on the plane would be smoking, and there was this kind of collective sense of smoking, and you look at that and you go, how could you not realize that would be detrimental to your health? That's the way people like Sherry Turkle are looking at the way we're engaging technology. And saying in the not too distant future, people are going to be going like, what in the world were you thinking? Which to me makes the challenge that really the only option we have is to get ahead of the curve or to be a negative statistic. Now, I think there's another way to frame this. And it's the way that I've been framing it for myself since that moment in Ecuador. And in fact, almost worked this into the Hello, My Name is Anxiety series, but we're like, no, there's a whole series here. And it's really this question of, especially for those of you who identify as Christ followers, what does it mean to love God with your mind? Like there's a whole other conversation there. See, in Jesus' day, there was a tradition of having the ability not just to know the Scriptures. They all knew what the Scriptures said. Many of them had the whole Scriptures memorized. But one of the games they would play was summarize the Scriptures while standing on one foot. It was the ability to be brief with your words. Jesus was more or less playing this game with somebody when he was asked, and in his response, maybe among the most famous things Jesus ever said. He said, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Now, students of Scripture will recognize that Jesus has added layers to this statement. And it would seem that one of the possibilities here is as the understanding of human self was expanding, so did Jesus' use of vocabulary. I think that in today's world, he would say with all your emotion. Because there's this new word that we use to refer to the human person. Now, was he thinking about an iPhone and the internet? Of course he wasn't. But it does seem that he had an appreciation for the fact that God doesn't just want parts of you, but all. And loving him and loving people would require your mind. And so there's this question, what does it mean to love God with your mind? What does that look like? And I think as people who are bombarded with opportunities with technology, it takes a pretty sincere investment into the question and maybe weeks to kind of get to the bottom of it. Do you remember that movie WALL-E? Here's a couple numbers for you that I just kind of bumped into this week. So the iPhone was released on Friday, June 29th of 2007. Wall-E was released 52 weeks later on Friday, June 27th of 2008. Now here to me is part of what's startling is we're not even 10 years in. So I don't know how invasive you feel that this type of technology has been to your relationships. Here's the crazy part. We're only not even 9 years into the whole thing. Many of us in Montana, we just got it like last week because we didn't even have the technology before then. You know, in the book of Exodus, one of maybe the most framing story in the entire text is of these people who God, out of no merit of their own, rescues and gives a name and a purpose. Their story progresses in such a positive way that they find themselves in Egypt, and they end up, because of a guy named Joseph, in this very privileged place in the midst of this very wealthy empire. And in the midst, it would seem, of enjoying the place and the privilege of empire, they kind of lost sight of everything. Suddenly, all they wanted was the privileges that came with empire. And then as empires go, things turned and went south pretty quickly, and they found themselves in this very undesirable place. And for generations, the entire value system, the purpose, the grandeur of being God's people was completely lost. But eventually it would seem that things got so bad that there was this remnant driven by God's grace who started to cry out to him. And the text tells us that this God, he heard their cry, and in the midst of that, he sidled up to a guy named Moses and said to Moses, hey, let's go do something about this. Moses, led by God, empowered by God, went back to Egypt because he himself was raised in the palace. He found audience very quickly with the king of Egypt. And he says to the king of Egypt, hey, let my people go. Let God's people go. Let them go worship God at this mountain. And Pharaoh says, no, they're not going to go worship God. They're going to stay here and work for me. And Moses says, no, Yahweh is warning you. You better let him go work for him. And Pharaoh's going, no, they're going to stay here and worship me. And one of the nuances of that text is the word worship and work, it's the same word. And so there's this kind of massive tug-of-war happening between Pharaoh and God about who these people belong to and who their work is supposed to benefit and what the purpose of their lives are. Well, listen to this interaction, because Pharaoh eventually has enough, and being among the most powerful people in the world, he just says to Moses in verse 4 of chapter 4, it says, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working. Notice there's no value on persons. It's all about production. It's all about what do you get. And then we get an insight even further into Pharaoh's strategy. It says that same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they're crying out, let's go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they can keep working and pay no attention to lies. Now, to Pharaoh's credit, he's onto something here that sociologists have understood for a long time and practiced ever since by many people. What Pharaoh understood was the thought, my life is for more. The thought, there's more to it than this. The thought is, I have a purpose grander than this. It was born of the privilege of idle time. It was the opportunity to have thoughts that actually led to this. Something we're going to talk about in the third week of the series is reclaiming boredom and the value that some of the greatest discoveries and most aha moments come when we're bored, and yet we're armed with devices that ensure that we never are. You know, historians in studying what brought us out of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, what led to things like the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, what they observed is that the mechanization of human labor was a big piece of it. That urbanization that followed that, what it created for people was idle time to ask questions that were more transcendent in nature and to go, wait a minute. Is this really what my life is all about? That's what Pharaoh's onto. That's what he's leveraging. That's why he's saying, hey, I tell you what, let's just give them more work to do, and they'll stop thinking about these bigger questions. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood because this could be construed as being overly dramatic, but it strikes me, I wonder if Pharaoh was trying to pull off the same thing today, if all he would really have to do is go, hey, I know what we need to do. Let's just give them all an iPhone. And let's give them this really fast internet connection everywhere they go, at home and at the office, on their refrigerator door, in their car. Let's just make sure they're never alone and never disconnected. And then they'll stop thinking about their marriage and their kids and the direction of their lives and this God who supposedly loves them deeply. Let's just hook them up with Twitter. You know, my friend Vern my friend Stan, who, when I was sitting in the back row of his church for years as a high school student trying to figure out God, he used to say this all the time. Go ahead to that next slide. He would say, sin, it takes you further than you wanted to go, keeps you longer than you wanted to stay, and costs you more than you wanted to pay. Now, I'm not trying to equate our iPhones and the internet, any of that, with sin, but I do think there's a dynamic for most of us, especially those of us who are in our 20s and beyond. Like you, like me, walked into the Verizon store at some point and you got yourself an iPhone. And at some point, you signed up for the internet because you decided you were tired of scabbing off your neighbor's internet because they finally put a password on it. And you kind of arrived at those decisions kind of innocently because it just seemed like this is a good tool and I can use it, and it is. But if you're anything like me, there is this sense of like, wait a minute. I had no idea how far this could take me. I had no idea what it could do to my relationships. I guess what I'm trying to do in this series is provoke us to go, wait a minute, let's take a breath. Because listen, when you went to school and graduated, you weren't hoping to be mediocre. You wanted to contribute in great ways. You wanted to serve people in significant ways, and now maybe you've settled for Facebook. And when you got married and when you had kids, there's all these goals. And I just, at the risk of being overly dramatic, I wonder if Wally might be a bit prophetic in the way we're approaching life. And my friend Vern, who I worked for 10 years, when his youngest daughter graduated high school, he and his wife Rami asked both his daughters, I don't know in what context, but they asked him, what did we do well, what did we do poorly? And one of the things that they got back from their daughters was they said, when you made the decision that phones don't go to the bedroom, and I think it was 10 o'clock for them, that at 10 o'clock, all phones, everyone's phones go here. They said, we hated you for that. But now one is a college student, the other one fresh out of high school. We're looking at their parents, pretty grounded Christ-following gals, going, that was the smartest thing you ever did. The searching that you saved us from at 2 o'clock in the morning, the texts that you protected us from, the distractions that come with that, thank you. Now, I'm not necessarily offering that as a prescriptive parenting tool, though it might be worth considering, but rather as kind of a metaphor of what I think this series could do to all of us. I think to really get into this, to really delve into this, to really do the self-audit that I'm going to beg you to do, it's going to require that kind of emotional response, the sense of like, ugh, I hate this. Might even create conflict in some relationships, but the challenge that I guess I want for you is to consider what might future you say to you when you get there. I mean, because can you imagine if the trajectory continues where that might take you in your relationships? And can you imagine if you got intentional and created some boundaries, what kind of marriage you might be able to have in 10 years? What kind of relationship you might be able to have with your kids? The type of productivity you could create in your work and in life. Here's my one challenge for you, and I hope you'll do it. I never know. That's why I do this, not counseling, because I don't know when people don't do it. It's really a good arrangement, because I get it. It's hard. We're busy. But would you, that sounded cynical. I don't mean it that cynically. But would you be willing to pick two relationships? Maybe it's a work relationship. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's a son or a daughter. Maybe it's just a friend that you spend time with. Would you pick two relationships, and would you be willing to look across the table and just ask this question: how is my engagement of technology negatively impacting our relationship? Would you just be willing, before you assume that it's not, would you just be willing to ask the question? To as mutuals, son and dad, as mutuals begin to go like, okay, so what's the dynamic here? And what do we want to steer ourselves clear of? And for those of you who follow Jesus, those of you who will get up in the morning and practice chair time and get centered and spend some time praying and reading, would you be willing to ask God the same question? And just say, like, Lord, in what ways does the way I engage this thing negatively impact you and I? I'm not suggesting that there's nothing positive about it. I'm just suggesting that maybe we would be wise to get out in front of it and give it some boundaries. And then next week, I want to jump a little bit more in depth into some tools as to how we actually do some of this. Let me pray. God, Lord, we recognize that this is pervasive and has the potential to, it's got some pretty major implications in our relationships. Pray that marriages would be healed because of it, that relationships with kids would get deeper, that workplace connection and productivity and creativity would grow. Jesus, would you give us the wisdom to hear what you have for us in this and the courage to walk it out? Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.